Good morning. Well, if you like to take notes, I like to build my sermons in a way that you can take notes. So if you like to do that, there'll be some fun little note-taking places in here. And so today, in the United States, we would call it the Thanksgiving season, and which is toward the end of the month. There's a lot of turkey, a lot of parades, a lot of desserts, a lot of family gatherings, which is connected to giving thanks for the time of harvest. In a very old story, which I'll share with you here in a little bit. But as we find ourselves in this season of Thanksgiving, many churches have just finished celebrating the Harvest Sunday recently, and we just had the time of harvest with the Taddy holidays. And as well, today being the 5th of November was for about 200 years, the National Day of Thanksgiving in the United Kingdom, going back to 1605, after the foiled gunpowder plot. So from 1605 to 1859, this was Thanksgiving Day. So I thought it appropriate with the calendar to talk a bit about Thanksgiving. And so whatever reason you draw from today for wanting to give thanks, this season across various cultures throughout October and into November has a lot to do with drawing us back and reminding us that it's important to give thanks. It's important for our heart, it's important for our physical life, and it's especially important for our spiritual life. And so we, as well, within a few seasons, as we cross through this season of giving thanks, we will enter into another season, which we traditionally call Advent, which kicks off 4 Sundays before Christmas. And that first Sunday is traditionally centered around the reason why we have hope. So we find ourselves in this season between Thanksgiving and hope. And so as we pass through it, I thought it would be fitting to share a story of both great hope, of great thanksgiving, but with hope, there's usually also great tragedy, and that's important. So our story starts in the New World of the Americas in the 1580s with the birth of a baby. And as we zoom in, we center in upon a little village called Patuxet, and we meet the Wampanoag tribe, and this baby was called Tasquantum. Now, if you're growing up in America, you loosely hear the story growing up in school, and this fella is most commonly known as Squanto, if you've ever heard that name. Now, we know very little about the history of Squanto until the year 1605, where things go very south for him, because it's believed Squanto, along with 4 other tribesmen, were kidnapped from their village. Squanto was taken from his home, his people, and spent the next 9 years, is believed, as a slave of some sort to Sir Fernando Gorges. Now, we don't know if Gorges instituted this kidnapping. We don't believe so. But he bought these tribesmen later on, and the idea was to train them to be liaisons between the English-speaking traders and the local tribesmen so they could do trading and merchant. And so in 1614, now that Squanto knows English, he gets to go back home. 9 years away from his home. So he gets back home. But you see, the same year, there was another man named John Smith. You've seen Disney's Pocahontas? Same guy, totally different story, It's a bit made up in there. But John Smith, he has a ship. And he needs to finish up some business, though. So he leaves it in the hands with a fellow named John Hunt. And so John Hunt wants to make a little bit of extra money. So John Hunt is under orders to load up with furs and other items that he's going to take back, but decides to pad his cargo with the humankind. And once again, he lures some local tribesmen to the ship under the guise of offering a really good trade deal, kidnaps them, which includes Squanto and a dozen others. So once again, Squanto has now been kidnapped. He's beaten and tied up below deck. Less than a year after he had been back home, it's happening again. And we've had situations in our life where, something terrible happens and you feel a slight reprieve and then it just happens again. And it's almost like the second time is even worse than the first because you're already just beginning to heal. You've been beaten down and you're just beginning to get back up and you're knocked down again. To have things begin to turn around and have the hope literally beaten out of you. So at this point in life, we are often quite tempted just to give up. I'm going to throw in the towel. Life has just handed me lemons and I am not making lemonade with it. It's just going into the garbage. It's terrible the first time. It's a serious tragedy the second time. And sometimes you feel like you just have nothing left. And so Squanto and his fellow tribesmen were locked below deck in very terrible conditions for days, which I'm sure felt endless and hopeless, as he trekked back across the Atlantic, this time to Spain, for Hunt to unload his cargo and wants to be sold again. Squanto was taken to the slave market. Sir Fernando Georges, which is considered the father of English colonization of the North Americas, accounts it this way. It happened there that there had been one Hunt who seized upon the poor creatures that in confidence of his honesty had put themselves into his hands. And stowing them below deck under the hatches, the number of 24 were carried from the straits where he sought to sell them as slaves. And he sold as many as he could get his money for. But you see, something happened. The friars of those parts took the rest from them and kept them to be instructed in the Christian faith, and so disappointed this new and devilish project. So as George's account, the church doing what it does best when it is being Christ in the world, meddled in the wicked plans of Thomas Hunt, grabbed these fellows, prevented the sale of Squanto and some of his tribesmen. And so the next 4 years, as they tried to prepare to get Squanto back home along with these other freed captives, was not only free, but for the first time he heard the gospel. He lived with these men who told him about Christ and taught him the Bible. And we don't know much about his time in Spain, but what we do know is that these monks helped get Squanto to London, where he's able to make acquaintance with a man named John Slaney. And John Slaney needed a translator. And you know how life goes. Sometimes it's just like, as Les said a minute ago, you don't know what's coming. You don't know if it's bad, you don't know if it's good. And sometimes the things that look bad end up turning around and being good later on. But Squanto's life has just been one terrible situation after another. How can God bring good out of such a situation? Even though we know that the scripture says that God can bring good out of these terrible situations for those who love him. He wanted a translator, John Slaney, so he could go back and try to make peace with Squanto's old tribe and his people. Because what had happened is that after this kidnapping by John Hunt, an uprising had been happening, and there was unrest. They were understandably quite upset. This, of course, provided Squanto a way back home, so he took it. Squanto, being trained in English and as a tracker, got to return home, and I'm sure it was a joyous day as he began to make his trek back, and he stepped off the ship. But the story, didn't continue so joyfully. He did make it back to Pawtuxet, but when he arrived, his tribe was nowhere to be found. What they found when they eventually arrived in what would be called southern Massachusetts in 1619 must have horrified them both. To add tragedy to injustice and wickedness, an outbreak of a plague had ravaged the area, and his entire tribe were decimated. His entire people were gone. His village was abandoned and destroyed, and everybody in Squanto's family and everybody they had known was dead. Villages for miles inland were completely and utterly empty. And in time, Squanto found a few survivors from a neighboring village who brought them to their chief. And the chief told them of the grisly details of the plague that had spread. It had killed 90% of the native people of the region. Squanto was literally alone. He was broken. Everything that he had known and loved had been ripped from him and from his life. While he had been unjustly kidnapped, everybody that he had known was dead. Now, if this was a movie, we know how the story would go. Squanto, having everything he loved taken from him, began a campaign to destroy every foreign person upon the soil from his homeland. Using his skills, he tricked the English into a sense of safety, rallying the rest of the tribes. They ambushed and killed hundreds of colonists, eventually driving all invaders from the area. If it was a movie. But that's not what would happen. That is not what happened. You see, because Squanto was a different person than he had been. Something had happened in his life back in Spain amongst the monks. Squanto had not only learned English, but also learned about this fella named Jesus. And he knew that Jesus had died to pay the penalty for his sins, and how through Christ God had forgiven him and wanted to make him like he was created to be. That God was the one true God of the universe and was at work in his life, and there was a plan. But I wonder what Squanto was feeling in that moment. If you can put yourself there, standing, stepping off the ship, looking at your once wonderful home and finding it gone. That feeling of hopelessness and emptiness. The rubble of his former home, wondering how God would be at work. And the story might sound somewhat familiar because in Scripture we have a very similar story, and it happened to another man named Joseph. Not to be confused with the Christmas Joseph, which we'll talk about in a few weeks, of course. But this is the Old Testament Joseph, a son of Jacob. Joseph was one of 11 other sons of Jacob. But he, among the rest of his brothers, was loved the most by his dad, which wasn't okay, right? His dad shows a bit of favoritism. And if you remember, the story gave him this coat of many colors. And alongside this beautiful coat, a lot of jealousy, some dreams that Joseph had that he told his brothers about ruling over his brothers one day. Didn't turn out so well. His brothers were a tad upset. Jealousy came on and they decided to get even with Joseph. They tricked him. And as the story goes in Genesis 37, they threw him down a well and left him for dead. But that was before they realized they could make some money off their brother. And they sold him into slavery. As he was dragged away, the rest of the brothers told their father that their brother was dead, had been ripped apart. They brought him the coat that they had torn and put animal's blood on it. As a positive note, next time your siblings do something mean, you have something to give thanks for, that they're not Joseph's brothers. You can give thanks that your siblings never sold you into slavery as a child either. If you want to take notes, your first note is this: that our physical life is a parade of problems sometimes. It just is. Life is unfair. There is a lot of unfairness in this world. And sometimes it is just like a problem goes by and another seems to come up. Joseph's story was a rough one, in which Squanto finds himself away from home, away from his family, and a loss of freedom. How do we feel when our life as we know it is swept away in problem after problem? When we get stuck in that feeling of hopelessness, because in that feeling of hopelessness, we see no future. We see no recourse. We see no way out. And like a character in a book, it's like the character has fallen off the page and lost his story when we feel hopeless. We've lost our purpose and our meaning. Sometimes it feels like there's no end in sight, that this is going to last forever. No good is going to come of this. You feel out of control. But what we do see with Joseph is that he didn't lose hope. We don't see him giving up and giving into death. What we see in Genesis 39 is God, through Joseph's circumstances of life, using that for good. Even though Joseph was in slavery, God blesses him through it and blesses those around him. And God is with Joseph there, even though the parade of problems keep happening. Because within this situation, if you know the story, his master's wife took a shining to him, tried to come on to him. Joseph ran away out of the situation, and his master's wife accused him of raping her. So his master locked him in the palace prison. So one thing that's bad leads to another and another. And so Joseph, on top of everything else, just trying to do the right thing, was accused of a crime, locked in a prison with no end to his sentence. But Joseph was not alone. In verses 20 through 23 of Genesis chapter 39, it says this: "But while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him." While you are there within your own prisons, God is there with you. The Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Joseph stayed faithful. And the basis of his faith was this ability to have hope. The second thing is God's presence is perpetually with his people. It's easy to lose hope when we forget one of the points, as it reminds us in Deuteronomy 31:6, to be strong and to be courageous. This isn't something that comes from ourselves. This isn't just our own doing. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you, nor will he forsake you. And there's a lot of thems in our world. And I'm sure right now you can think of a few thems to be terrified about, to be concerned about, to be worried about. A lot of thems have to do with the fear and the loss of control. Sometimes it has to do with mean and troublesome people. I have a lot of thems that come through my life that can bring stress, incite fears. But even, especially me, I have to continually remind myself that God goes with me. He will not leave me, nor will he forsake me. And we as human beings, we are not without doubt. Doubt is important within our life because it's a warning signal that we have questions that need answered. And so we need to ask those questions. Where we find a place of thanksgiving isn't in hoping for things just to get better. In time, things will just get better, we hope. But it's in the hope of the person of God and what he has done in the past, who he is in the present, and what he will do in the future. Joseph trusted in who God is. Our hope isn't based in just an idea, but it's based in what we know about God and what he's done, who he is, and what we trust he can do. We don't know what he will do, but we trust in what he can do. And just to make a note, I can leave and forsake God. I can cut him out of my life. I can stop listening to him. But when we join him in his covenant, when I give my life over to him, asking to be his people and for him to be my God, he stands firm. He stands faithful. He keeps his promises, and nothing that we go to him, to tell him, to share with him is going to scare him, frighten him, throw him off to the side, and make him go, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe you just said that." Hope has legs to stand on because God keeps his promises. And so now back to our story. Now we center in to Plymouth in the south of England. It was 1620 when an old sailing ship at the end of its life was hired to go on a voyage. It had started in Southampton and traveled along slightly, and its passengers were quite a mix of different people. The most famous of the people on board were known as Puritans, a group of Christians from Holland who were brought to England aboard a tough and little old warship known as the Speedwell. But before finally leaving the coast of England, the Speedwell had multiple leaks, and all the passengers were unloaded and put aboard another ship with the name of the Mayflower. William Bradford made note that he assumed that the leaks were man-made. They were not by accident and were brought on by fear of some of the crew of dying of starvation in trekking to this new world. So the Mayflower, with 102 passengers, made up about half being Puritans and the rest being various others seeking new life and new beginnings in this new world, in this colony. A fresh start. Not an easy start by any means. Along with the passengers, there's roughly 30 crew members that set sail. And so the first part of the journey, it went okay. But the seas were very rough and they were very dangerous. First of all, due to pirates, which in part the Mayflower was actually built to withstand. Not to go fight and track down, but protect cargo from pirates. To avoid any pirate trouble, the Mayflower crew took a more northern route. And along the way, there was a great storm. And a horrendous wind caused the main beam of the ship to crack. And it was a really bad situation because you couldn't just go out and fish for a new main beam. You were a little bit stuck. But something interesting happened. The crew looked around on board to see what they had. And what the Puritans had on board was a giant iron screw that was used probably either for a printing press, but possibly for home construction or a cider press. And so because this was on board, it saved the day. It allowed the main beam to be raised back into place so it could be held tightly in place so it could be repaired as best as possible so the journey could continue. What a grand coincidence that happened to be. Now, after all the hardships on board, the loss of life was actually minimal, with only one rather, as the folks on board would say, rather cruel crewmate had passed away. He had been very cruel to everyone on board. When land was finally sighted, it was November of 1620. But the journey wasn't at all over. You see, for the next few months, a lack of a good place to form a colony could not be found. So they kind of floated along the coast looking for a place to settle. And things on board the ship were not good smelling in any way, shape, or form. It was very rough. They couldn't find a good place to lay anchor, a good place to make sure there was enough food and farmland and hunting. So the Mayflower continued to set sail along the coast until it found a spot to make home and called this new place Plymouth. But the first winter was very brutal on these new settlers. And without adequate food, half of the original settlers died. Half. And all hope seemed lost. Now, to make matters worse, they had some small interactions with the local tribes that did not go well. There had been some attacks. And if you remember, or if you know this from earlier in the story, they were still very upset from that kidnapping that had taken place years before. And they were especially cautious. So where was God in all of this? They would have been wondering. The Puritans had fled their homes and their country to find a place where they thought they could worship God freely in their own way. And as the earlier settlers of just up the coast, Jamestown, and what had happened with them, which was not so pretty either, where was God in all of these situations? Could rest and peace be found? And so when the Pilgrims first saw land on that previous November day we spoke about, they did something important. They decided to stop and to give thanks for God seeing them on their journey across the sea, and they read from Psalm 100 together. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give him thanks Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. These Puritans that would come to be known as the Pilgrims began this undertaking by laying the foundation with thanks and placing themselves fully into God's hands. Not that they weren't, but they were placing themselves into God's hands. They were making that decision that whatever happens is within God's hands. But now, how is God still good if this has happened? What will become of us, they must have asked. For Joseph, I wonder if he was thinking the same thing as he spent years of his life in prison for a crime he didn't commit, but God was there and continued to speak through him, showing him that his presence was with him. And as God gave to the Pharaoh dreams, it allowed a place for Joseph to come and to share what those dreams meant. And through Joseph saved not only Egypt, but all of the surrounding country, leading all the way up to where his family was living. Through Joseph's horrendous time within prison and the injustice, he was elevated to the second in command within Egypt. He was given control to allow to prepare for this great famine that Joseph said was going to happen, that God had given forewarning about. This place of great starvation. And because of Joseph and his journey, salvation came to the whole area. Egypt became more rich and powerful than it had ever been before. Joseph was given this seat of high authority, and through it, Joseph reconciled with his brothers and showed forgiveness. God allowed the parade of pain to work through Joseph's life, but he did not leave Joseph. He was there working out his plan perfectly. And this is the story of Thanksgiving as well that I'm sharing with you. Because God's plan is perfectly precise. And that's your third note if you're taking notes, even when we are unsure how this is going to work out. You see, for Squanto, his family, his friends were all gone. But through all the pain and the anguish, Squanto came to know that the God of the universe, and like Joseph, that God had a plan even for Squanto. So one day a friend of Squanto's, a fellow tribesman named Samoset, came upon this new group of settlers and reported back to Squanto, who knew English. And so Squanto went out to meet them. Why were these English settlers any different from any others, you might ask? Well, because the place that these settlers had decided to make home, you see, this place where Plymouth and this new colony was being built, this place where they had lost over 50% of their friends and their family, was Squanto's former village and where it had been. And to the great delight of the pilgrims, when Squanto arrived, he not only spoke English, but what joy there was when Squanto was also a follower of Christ. You see, they were lost. They were hopeless. They saw no end to the suffering in sight. They saw no way out. This is going to be the end. One more winter and we are gone. But here comes a friendly face. Someone who is their brother. Can you imagine being in a foreign land, struggling to survive? Half of your town has died, and out of somewhere, somebody arrives in this foreign land speaking your own language and loves you. These pilgrims weren't only settled on his former home, but they were followers of Christ as well, making them his new blood family. And due to this great providence from God leading Squanto through this journey of his life, he provided peace, and at least for a short time, this new peace between the tribes in the area, and gave guidance to these settlers, teaching them how to survive in this new land, teaching them the nuts and bolts about how to plant in this new land, and show them techniques. Squanto's guidance most literally saved them by providing them a new way to harvest and for the Plymouth colony to flourish. And this is the story of the American Thanksgiving. But you see, these people would not have survived without what happened to Squanto in his life. And one of my favorite parts of this story is there was another gift given to the world by the name of Clint Eastwood. And without the troubles of Squanto's life, we wouldn't get to celebrate and watch great Westerns during these holiday times. Because Clint Eastwood is a direct descendant of these Puritans that survived through Squanto's life. And in all seriousness, in the perfect time, God stepped into our world. He took on flesh. In the perfect time, he showed us the perfect image of who he is. In the perfect time, he set aside his glory and his power, and he emptied himself and became nothing for our sake. He endured ridicule, beatings, and unbearable suffering so that we might have hope. If you don't know Christ this morning, I encourage you to ask the questions, to voice the doubts, to voice the curiosities, and don't be afraid to ask those questions. Even sometimes we go, oh, that's just silly, or oh, I should just know that. Don't be afraid to ask those questions. I'm going to close this morning just by once again reading Psalm 100. And I would encourage you through the month of November to read Psalm 100. Maybe write it down on a note card, put it up in your home, and give thought over it this month. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise his name. For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. May this also be our prayer for this month to draw us back to Thanksgiving. Let's close with a word of prayer.